Okay, so this morning I'm going to be working on various aspects of education during the Victorian period and showing how Dickens represents those in his work. The really big thing to get started with is his overall position. He supported comprehensive, non-sectarian education. So let's just get a clear sense of what that means. Comprehensive or universal, both words were used, would refer to covering all subjects and being available to all people. All right, so that was the first principle. And the second principle, that it should be non-sectarian. This would mean that it's not connected with the church, it's not connected with any religious group, and it's not connected with any political groups either. It's an independent form of education that is not biased by church or state. So that would be the bottom line of what Dickens stood for. And he was clearly interested in education all the way through. It crops up so frequently in his writings, and just to quote from a fairly famous standard writer on the subject, we see his evidence of his interest in education in his fiction, his journalism, his public speeches. We see if you want to study his interest in education, don't just look. I mean, obviously you get a lot from looking at his novels, but you get a more by looking at his journalism, looking at his speeches. They would give you a greater sense of the nuance of his ideas about education. But on the other hand, you know, he follows what's going on in education very closely. He's keenly interested in the subject, but he doesn't really have his own educational philosophy. He doesn't have his own kind of practical program for education. And especially in his fiction, he doesn't cover everything that's going on. There's just a range of, for example, we're going to be looking at the so-called public school, the elite school. He doesn't really write about that. Okay, he's more interested in the kind of education that the working class people are getting. So he doesn't cover the whole thing comprehensively, and he doesn't have a particular program, really, of educational reform or an educational policy. So that would be Litvak's take on it in Charles Dickens and Victorian Education. When I put this up online, there'll be a link to his paper, which you can read if you're interested. It's available online. Okay, we've looked at a little bit of Dickens's life, but let me just remind you about his schooling. That he began his schooling at a place called Chatham, and he was a pupil at a so-called dame school. Well, this idea of a dame school, we haven't really talked about what that was. It was a private establishment, and usually the person running it would not be qualified, not have any special training, just be, you know, obviously it would be somebody who could read and write, would be somebody who has some modicum of education, but there would be usually no formal training for such people. And in this case, it was a deficient establishment. It didn't work well. It was an unsatisfactory place. And the sort of place that we can see in his novels, in Great Expectations, there's a pretty good example. Here we got it, and oops, I have not plugged in the volume, so I have to do that before we can begin. Sorry, this is just going to take a little second. Here we go. Should be all right now. Okay. So, this is Great Expectations, and the young David is going to a school. The young woman who is doing most of the teaching is somebody that David really likes and respects. In fact, he later on thinks that he wants to marry her, but he's too late. She marries someone else. And you can get a sense of the kind of unprofessional atmosphere of some of these places. There's the ridiculous Mr. Wopsle, who's trying to teach them about Shakespeare. There's all the students who are not listening, and there's the grandmother who's asleep and wakes up and just starts beating the kids when she wakes up. So it's a comic scene, but it gives you a sense of the kind of chaotic education that Dickens himself may have had. Sorry, here we go. They're reciting the Bible.
Eliezer, and Eliezer begat Matter, and Matter begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. That's all for tonight. Mr. Wopsle is going to test you on what you've learned. Please, miss. Pip were late again, miss. Was. Puddinghead.
Rise. This evening I shall begin with a reading from the works of the sweet swan of Avon. William
Shakespeare!
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear.
Young David going and asking Biddy for some special attention because he wants to be a gentleman.
What are you doing? I wanted to talk to you, Biddy. Well, I'm here. I wanted to ask you something. Will you teach me? I do, don't I? I mean, specially. What's this, Pip? You know everything. I don't know anything.
Who says so? Miss Havisham uptown?
No?
Pretty little niece of hers, then?
Biddy.
Lord, I love us. The wait, Grandma!
You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause would hold you now? Vipers! Villains!
Tickle you!
Reading out the word.
Wrong time! Wrong time!
The vines.
Grandma, you give me something to eat!
Oh, my soul.
Okay, so it's comic, but that's sort of the kind of dysfunctional education that village children or children, a lot of poorer children, if they got any education at all, it might be something along those lines. In a private house for a couple of pennies a week, they would go along in the evenings for a few hours. So then when he was 9 years old, he went to a Baptist school. Baptist school, baptism, of course, being a form of Protestantism. And he seemed to get on okay there, but unfortunately it was after that the crisis happened in his family and he had to leave and go and work in a factory. And then after that, because he was only in the factory for a fairly short period, although it affected him badly, he went to Wellington House Classical and Commercial Academy. Again, not a particularly good move. We've got William Jones, and Dickens used him as the model for Mr. Creakle, the headmaster in David Copperfield, the sadistic guy that, well, we saw him, didn't we? There's a dramatic representation of him from a stage adaptation. He forces the young David to carry a placard saying, "Take care," he bites. Because when Mr. Murdstone tries to beat David, David protects himself by biting Mr. Murdstone's hand. So he was based on Dickens's own experience. Okay, so that was his education, and then at the age of 15, that was it. He left school. Right, no question of university or anything. Just finished school at 15, and in a way, he was quite lucky to get that much education. A lot of children at that time got very little or no education. Okay, so let's take a look at the history of education, starting with the elite, the upper class, the education for the upper classes. During the Middle Ages, education was basically in the hands of the church, and Latin was the language of the educated, and it was also the language of the Bible. And then the schools themselves were called Latin grammar schools because they basically taught Latin grammar. They used the Bible as a means of it, the basis of this is the language. So you have to learn how to read this stuff. So we'll teach you Latin, and we'll use the Bible, the language of the Bible. And so the students, who would all be boys in those days, would study two sets of learning. The trivium was 3 subjects, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay, rhetoric would be very important because that gave them the ability to debate things, which was always very important in Western education, and is still one of the big differences that you notice between Japan and the West today. And then they would study the quadrivium, the 4 subjects, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. It may seem like an odd mix, but music was seen in those days as being like a form of arithmetic, okay? Because it is sort of very technical, really, if you think about it. Okay, they thought about music in terms of the technicality of music, the number of vibrations. Okay, down, 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 and it's doubled up. Okay, it's a double vibration, and it's calculated exactly how many vibrations there are between. So they regarded music as being a form of more like arithmetic or something. Anyway, along came the Renaissance, and education started to become more secular, less connected with the church. Christianity, of course, was still important to people in their daily lives, but it was now combined with the humanist philosophy and the classical literature of the ancient empires of Greece and the ancient Roman Empire and the ancient Greek culture. So it was no longer focused so directly on the church. And that's why, that's why we end up calling the private schools today are called public schools, where we'll see that in a minute. Basically, though, the real upper classes, the very top elite, wouldn't go to school at all. All right, they'd be educated privately. They'd have tutors at home. All right, if you were a very high-class person, you'd just have a private education with a tutor. And then these Latin grammar schools of the Middle Ages slowly started to divide into 2 types of school. One type came to be known as public schools. And they were called public schools not because they were really public. I mean, in theory they were, but in practice Only rich people could afford to could go to them. But the point is that they were separate from the church, so they were public in that sense. They didn't belong to the church. And then grammar schools. And originally, these were just basically two names for. There wasn't such a difference, but they started to develop a different kind of culture, and people would refer to public schools would be the boarding schools, and grammar schools would be the day schools. And so that's how they developed, and that's how they would have been in the 18th and 19th centuries. Or particularly in Dickens's time, these schools would both have existed, but Dickens doesn't really write about these kinds of schools. They're too privileged for him. Even the grammar schools, which are more merchant classes, middle classes, would be too... He's really interested in the poor and what sort of education they're getting or not getting. So you've got these boarding schools called public schools, and the students would live in dormitories, and they would be more for upper class children who would, if they were boys, they would have a governess or a tutor while they were young, and then they'd be sent off to these schools. And it was a pretty tough regime. This is the time of the British Empire. This is the time when, boys had to learn how to be men. It was a bit like ancient Sparta. Sparta, famous for the kind of strict. The children would be separated off from their parents, and they would be raised in a very as to be warriors or something like that. It was a bit like that. Bullying was routine. Beating the children was normal. Violent sports. I mean, some of those sports events. You'd be lucky to. Well, I'm exaggerating when I say you'd be lucky to survive, but people would be carried off to hospital. It would be kind of routine. You have to be tough. So these public schools had that sort of image of being, this is the training ground. They go through that, and then they're going to be the elite that are going to be controlling the army. They're going to be controlling the British Empire. They're going to be, but they've got to be tough. So the public schools, to be honest, it wasn't such a great deal to be born in the upper classes if you had to go through those kinds of schools. Tom Brown's School Days gives the clearest explanation of that. And then the middle class children would typically go to day schools. Now, in theory, originally these schools were open to all people, rich or poor, but in practice, poor families just simply couldn't afford to spare their children. But that did sort of develop. Yeah, hi, there are Prince here. Okay. There were scholarships, for poorer children, and there would be, children who weren't all from privileged backgrounds that were going to those kinds of schools. But mostly they were the preserve of the rich. Even the grammar schools would be beyond what most working class children could aspire to. So get this. In British English, public school doesn't mean public school. Be careful, because in American English, it does mean public. Okay? What we say is public school is independent. It's private. So if you want to be clear and not ambiguous, you say independent schools and state schools. Okay? Independent schools would be also often known as public schools. All right, but they're not public in the American sense of the word, or even in the sense that we normally think of when we say public. Even today, the big six public schools: Eton, Rugby, Winchester, Harrow, Westminster, and Marlborough, and there are quite a few others, of course, but these are the big six, the most famous, and they would have been the top schools in Victorian times, and even today. If you look at members of parliament or heads of industry or the elite of the country, a lot of them will have been to these schools and then to Oxford or Cambridge. Okay, coming from this school background. Okay, so things haven't changed all that much in a way, although there is now comprehensive state education. For, I think, 94% of children go to the comprehensive state system. So you've got like about, well, 6% of, saying 6% of people go to private, independent education. That's true, but not all of them are public schools for the elite. Some of them could be remedial schools, okay? They're not necessarily elite schools, but the parents would have to have money to pay for their children to go there. But compared with Japan, where private education at high school is quite common, only 6%, even today, only 6% of British people are choosing to pay for their children's secondary education from up to the age of 16 or 18. Mostly they're going to comprehensive schools today. But to get back to Dickens in the 19th century, or get back to that period, we'd want to look at, as I mentioned just now, Tom Brown's School Days by Thomas Hughes, which was written in the middle of the 19th century. Very, very famous for its account of bullying, although in the movie versions, there are lots of movie versions of this story. The movie versions always build up the bullying to make it the most central part of the novel. If you actually read the novel, the bullying is just a small part of it. But it was going on, and other writers were writing about it. Thackeray, for example, writes about bullying in public schools and caning of children. And so it really, it was based on a tough idea of education, and that bullying was just accepted because that's how they learned to be tough. Okay, it wasn't scandalous or something that they thought shouldn't happen. It's just, no, that's normal. Yes, no, that's fine. Yes, all good fun. Except it wasn't. Of course, today, if you want to think about it, Hogwarts, of course, is based on that kind of model, isn't it? J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. It's a dormitory school, it's an elite school, it's a privileged place. It's interesting that she chose to set her novel in that sort of environment, because she herself is quite socialist, quite sort of left-wing in her views of society. In a way, she's feeding a sort of fantasy. I think those 94% of us who didn't go to those kinds of schools sort of have an image of them as wonderful places, which I'm not sure the 6% who did go to those schools, I'm not sure if they think it was so wonderful, but there's a sort of image of them. Sort of, they're almost a fantasy in a normal, an ordinary school child's mind. All right, so I think that's perhaps why Rowling chose to set her novel in such a school. Okay, back now to everyday reality for the poor, which is much more what Dickens was interested in and what he concerned himself with. Poor people would get very little or no education at all. And grammar schools and public schools, as I say, they were originally set up to provide education for all, but there was no gimu kyoiku, there was no requirement for children to go to school. There was no kind of obligation to go to school, and there was no funding. There was no money for them to pay for them to go to school. So parents would usually need their children to work or to contribute to the family economy. They wouldn't be able to send their children off to schools like that. So in practice, as I say, those schools became places for the rich. And you started during the 18th century, in the second half of the 18th century, you start to get initiatives for educating the poorer children. So Sunday school was one of those. And children would be taught to read using the Bible, as we saw, just now in that little video clip of an adaptation of Great Expectations. Sorry, David Copperfield. Children would be lined up in rows, and they'd read through the Bible, and they'd follow with their finger, They would have a piece of slate with a chalk to write on, and they would spit on it and rub it out with their sleeve to clean it off, and then they'd write again. If they did write on paper, it would be with an old-style pen made from a feather, or else made from a stick with a little quill put on it. They'd be dipping it into an inkwell and writing, and dipping it into an inkwell and writing. And again, even when I was first at school, when I was in primary school, we had a stick with a little nib at the end of it, and we would dip it into the ink to write. Okay, terribly difficult to write with. You'd always be getting big splodges of ink all over your page, and I was very jealous of people who could do it neatly because I couldn't. I was always making a mess. But yeah, that would be the sort of, very limited resources, very simple, but at least it was reaching quite large numbers of children, and it would take place on a Sunday. Usually after the family had gone to church, the children would stay behind, and there would be a Sunday school held. And then in the beginning of the 19th century, you get two important institutions set up, the British and Foreign School Society and the National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor. Well, as the full title of the second one indicates, Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Established Church, we can see that the second one is connected with the church. And it's continuing the idea that education should be in the hands of the church. It's interested in a religious education. And by the middle of the century, there were over 18,000 schools that were being run by these two organizations. So, you're looking, even though you haven't got Gimu Kyoiku yet, you haven't got obligatory education, that doesn't come in until 1870, you're starting to have quite a lot of schools, and it's becoming much more normal for children to attend schools, at least for some of the time. Big difference, of course, is the question of the church. And this was one of the reasons why it took so long. Other parts of Europe had Gimu Kyoiku, had obligatory education earlier than Britain. One of the reasons why Britain was so slow was because of the argument between these two institutions. Education should be with the church. No, it shouldn't. Yes, it should. No, it shouldn't. So they were fighting it out with each other. And that's why it took so long, really, for Britain to develop the England and Wales in particular, it was quite slow. And again, Litvak comments on this. For much of the 19th century, the issue of religious education proved to be the key obstacle in developing a pervasive national school system. They couldn't get a national school system going efficiently because they were kept arguing about whether the church should be responsible for it or not. Dickens, of course, as we said at the beginning, he favoured non-sectarian education. That's the kind offered by the British and Foreign School Society, not connected to the church. Okay. So continuing. By the middle of the 19th century, you got a variety of different kinds of schools. So there were these Sunday schools, dame schools, so-called ragged schools, because it didn't matter how poor or dirty or, you would be accepted at the ragged school. Other schools would have a sort of standard, like there might be a uniform for some of them, or there might be a kind of level that was expected before children were really accepted. But you could turn up to the ragged schools with no shoes, okay, as poor as you were. There was no kind of limit on that. And again, okay, I never went to school with, children who had no shoes, but my mother remembers it. Okay, back in the 1920s even, there were still children who would be going to school with no shoes. Okay. And also, actual factories and the bosses who were employing these children to work in factories and coal mines, they were being required to make sure that those children got some kind of education. So the famous Education Act was 1870, but even before that, things were moving in that direction. And of course, the workhouses were supposed to provide an education, but you may remember with Oliver Twist, his education was just learning how to recycle old rope. In other words, they called it education, but really he had to work for nothing. That's what it really was. And there was no central organisation for any of this. In fact, until quite recently, the British system of education altogether was administered locally, not controlled heavily by central government. So in those days, even more so, it would really depend on where you lived, and who you knew, and you might be lucky or you might not. Hello? So, 1870, the year that Dickens died, you started to get a system of compulsory education across the whole country. But even then, it takes time before it's really guaranteed that children are getting education. By the end of the century, it's established as the norm. All right, there would be a few children who, for some reason or other, were not getting an education. Gypsy children didn't get an education until fairly recently, many of them, because their families would be moving around, okay, and because their culture, they didn't see the need, okay. But that's one of the things that's sort of slowly changed over the years. And there would have been other children who somehow or other would manage to kind of escape regular schooling. But the normal thing for the vast majority of children was by the end of the century, there would be education until the age of 13. Okay, we've looked at, the education for the very poor, and we've looked at the education for the pretty rich. But there was something going on in between. There were cheap boarding schools, and they were scandalous, or at least many of them were simply places to get rid of unwanted children. Okay, we talked about Victorian men and prostitution. There was a lot of prostitution. What's going to happen when there's a lot of prostitution and they don't have contraception? There's going to be a lot of illegitimate children. Okay? The rich gentleman just pushes them off for £20 a year. Okay, sangze yengurai. In today's money, it sounds like nothing, but it would have been enough just to keep them fed with a minimum. Okay, sends them off to cheap boarding schools. And Dickens did not go to any such school. He lived with his family. He went to day schools, and he writes about those things in his novels, like David Copperfield, as we've already said. And we've got also, some positive stuff in the same novel. In David Copperfield, we've got his second school, David's second school in Canterbury, which is perhaps a little bit more like the Baptist school that Dickens went to for a couple of years before he had to work in the factory, and where he felt quite happy, where things were much more positive for him. But all of that would have been from his own experience. He didn't have any personal experience of these cheap boarding schools, although some of those schools might sometimes take boarders. All right, but for Dickens, he went as a day scholar. And then, okay, his first big popular success was Oliver Twist, and the basic idea of Oliver Twist was to bring attention to the injustices that were happening as a result of the new poor law, and to expose the workhouses, which were so dreadful that, I mean, if you had, it was you were better off being a criminal on the street. That's the whole point. Oliver does better when he's with Fagin's gang than he did in the workhouse. That was successful in terms of drawing people's attention to it, although he didn't achieve the reforms that he wanted to. He did at least focus attention on the problem, and then quite quickly, that was written from 1837 to 9, and then even before he'd finished writing Oliver Twist, the next year he started on his next project, and this time it was going to be these cheap boarding schools. He was going to expose them. So this was the subject of Nicholas Nickleby. And for some reason, a lot of these schools were in Yorkshire. Well, probably there's a good reason. It was a very remote part of England. Until the railways came and opened the country up, Yorkshire was a very wild place. All right, there were no big cities in Yorkshire. It was lost in kind of countryside and little villages where life could go on in a quite uncontrolled sort of way. In fact, if you know your Wuthering Heights at Ashigahara, you know how shocking life was. All the violence of Wuthering Heights, the violence, the nastiness, and there's nobody else around to kind of control it. There's very little society. People are living very remote, isolated lives. So where better? If you want to have scandalous schools, where better to have them than in a part of the country like that? So the Yorkshire boarding schools became kind of synonymous with scandalously poor levels of education. So Dickens, as a good reporter, went and investigated. He took his illustrator, Hablot Brown, and they went up to Yorkshire on the stagecoach to see what things were really like. Well, one of the schools they visited was called Bowes Academy, and it was run by a man called William Shaw. It was actually in Durham, just north of Yorkshire. It was in Durham, not Yorkshire, but it was basically the same type of school. And Dickens knew that Shaw had already got into trouble with the law, that he had been accused of neglecting children, and that there had been a court case. This is the actual building. It's still standing. This is the school. It's still there today. It's not a school anymore, of course. It's private cottages. People are living in them. Well, he based his Wackford Squares on William Shaw. The use of the same first letters, W.S., Wackford, Shaw, William... Wackford Squares, William Shaw, the use of the same first letters, and the fact that both characters, Shaw in real life had an eye patch. He had lost the sight in one eye and he had an eye patch, and Wackford Squares in the novel also has an eye patch. It was very, very clear who he was. He was pointing his finger at William Shaw, and as a result, that school was closed down, and many others of the same type were closed down. There's still quite a lot of debate about how fair Dickens was being. William Shaw's great-great-great-great-grandson, I think it is, has been conducting a campaign saying, this was terribly unfair, what Dickens did. He just wanted a good story. Actually, poor William Shaw cared for his children, and the reason that the children were suffering was not because he wasn't feeding them properly, but because some illness had come across from Russia. It had been brought into the country, and it was causing a terrible fever, and it was causing blindness, and it wasn't his fault. And he was trying his best, and he got good doctors in to look at those children. So there's quite an argument about whether Dickens really kind of falsified poor William Shaw and that he wasn't at all as bad as he's painted in Nicholas Nickleby. But that's a kind of another example of how, we said at the beginning, he's interested in a good story. He's not necessarily interested in reporting the facts. Yeah, I pointed that out in the first class with Dickens and journalism. So, okay, the idea that these Yorkshire schools were particularly kind of harsh places to be was something that was reinforced when Charlotte Bronte, we talked about Emily Bronte's Arachigaoka, Wuthering Heights, but it was her sister who published Jane Eyre in 1847, again, based very much on her own experience in real life. So she also was writing about a real school called Cowan Bridge, and two of her sisters died at that school. That's how bad it was. Okay. I should also say Dickens reported on children who died at William Shaw's school as well, although it may be that the reasons they died were not connected with cruelty. And again here, it wasn't exactly entirely their fault, but typhus fever, typhus? Yeah, typhus broke out, and a number of children died, including two of Charlotte and Emily's sisters. They died. But part of the reason why the fever was so severe was because the conditions in the school were poor. And again, the building is still standing, and again, it's being used as cottages now. It's not a school, but this is where all of that would have been happening, 200 years ago. All right, that's one of the things about England or Britain. That a lot of the history is still there. Okay, we don't have earthquakes, so old buildings tend to just stay there and get a bit older. Okay, they don't get pulled down after 40 years or something, as they typically do in Japan. But even then, Bronte goes on and says that after the reforms were made to in her fiction, it's called Lowood School in Jane Eyre, and she says the school thus improved became in time a truly useful and noble institution. So she doesn't feel that it's a hopeless thing. She just thinks that conditions had got bad and they had one or two rotten people at the top. But once they were swept away and the scandal was kind of exposed, that actually, it was worth having a school in such a place, and it was a good thing. And of course, it would be the only chance for somebody like in Jane Eyre's position, it would be the only chance for Jane to get an education, to get herself into a position where she wouldn't just have to be a working class girl in a factory or something all her life. So, tough as it was, people would accept such schools as being better than nothing. A lot of the pupils would be orphans, they'd be unwanted children, they'd be illegitimate, this sort of thing. And Dickens particularly was interested in those kinds of people, those kinds of children. What is our society doing for those people, for those children? And he writes about in Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield, Hard Times, Our Mutual Friend. Sorry if that was a bit quick. You can see it again. Okay, Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield, Hard Times, and Our Mutual Friend. I mean, they're not the only novels, but those are the main ones. Okay. I was going to slow that down. It's going a bit too fast, isn't it? So you could give it 2 or 3 times. Okay, so yeah, those would be the 4 main novels in which he writes about education. Okay, moving on now to teaching methodology, and this is going to be, getting fairly close to the end of this presentation, so bear with me for a few minutes. Teaching methodology, the actual strategies for teaching. Well, teaching is developed. The idea that everybody is got a right to education was something that was only just beginning. But then behind that, you have to have, okay, if everybody has a right to education, how is it going to be done? And so you get the question of methodology. Firstly, the practical step that was taken was to have a system of monitors. Just to explain that, it meant that advanced children, who were quicker at their lessons, or older children who had done it before, they would take on a sort of role as teacher helpers. All right, so that they would help the weaker students, they would help the younger students. So it's a sort of filtering the information through the school with the help of monitors. And basically, you've got very large classes. You might have 100 children and only one teacher. So the teacher sort of communicates to the better students, who then divide into groups and spread out among the rest of the students and explain things through to them. So it's sort of the teaching process filters down through the monitors. And then you get the first Secretary of Education, and he introduced the pupil-teacher-apprentice system, which sort of develops from the monitor system. And what happens here is that children that will function as monitors for 5 years, between the ages of 13 and 18. And then they'll go and they'll have teacher training for 3 years, and then they themselves will become teachers. So this was a program for making sure that there were going to be enough teachers to support a nationwide system of schools. All right, as I said, by the middle of the century, you already had 18,000 schools that were running without any kind of formal central control or anything. But two organisations were running 18,000 schools, and then there'd be all those little dame schools and things. How are you going to have teachers to keep this process going? So that was what they came up with. All right. And even earlier than that, well, you can see it again in Jane Eyre. She is a student at the school, and then she becomes a teacher, or she's offered. No, she's offered the chance of being a teacher. I think she does it. I've forgotten now slightly. But in the end, of course, she leaves and becomes a governess. But she's in the position of being a teacher at Lowood School for a while. So Dickens and Kay Shuttleworth, they met, they talked. Dickens did mix with, a lot of the important people of his day, and they agreed about quite a lot of things, especially the ragged schools, but they disagreed about other things, in particular teacher training. This is an example of Dickens sort of satirising the existing system, but not really having anything concrete to offer instead. In Hard Times, he writes about teachers who'd been lately turned at the same time in the same factory on the same principles, like so many pianoforte legs, that they were kind of factory-produced teachers. Okay, he wasn't very happy about the idea that they were churning out teachers just like a factory produces legs for a piano or something like that. And as I say, it's one of those situations where he criticises but isn't really giving a constructive alternative. He's against untrained teachers, but he's also against the methods for training them. What do you want, Mr. Dickens? It's easy to satirize, it's easy to criticize. And of course, that's what journalists tend to do. They tend to point at where things are wrong. Okay, it's my job to point out what's wrong. And Dickens would have said, what's wrong with what I'm doing? I'm pointing out the scandal of those boarding schools. I'm pointing out the scandal of the poor treatment that children are getting. It's not my job to offer concrete proposals for stopping it. My job as a journalist is to find out what's wrong and make society realise what's wrong, and then leave it to society and to the politicians to work out, how best to solve those problems. And he also criticises teachers who become obsessed with their own academic research and don't have time to really make proper contact with their students. That happens in Our Mutual Friend in particular. You get Headstone, who's the headmaster, and you've got his pupil teacher, Charlie Hexam, and they sort of get out of touch. They're so wrapped up in their own academic theory that they're not effective in communicating just with their students anymore. All right then. Pretty much then, to finish off here, we've got another of Dickens's amusing satirical passages. It's in Nicholas Nickleby, and there's the technique called the object lesson. The object lesson is where you learn something through practical experience. Okay? You have a practical, real situation, and that brings home the message. This is not just abstract learning, it's connected with real life, it's connected with reality. So, the new teacher, Nicholas Nickleby, is introduced into the classroom, and Squeers says, well, this is a class in English, spelling and philosophy, and he asks the pupils, where's the first boy? The first boy is not there. Okay? Well, he's cleaning the back parlour window, says one of the students. And so Squeers says, that's right, yes, so he is to be sure. We go upon the practical mode of teaching, Nickleby, the regular educational system. Clean, C-L-E-A-N, verb active, to make bright, to scour. Window, W-I-N, win, D-E-R, window, a casement. When the boy knows this out of a book, he goes and does it. It's just the same principle as the use of the globes. Okay, well, it's ironic because he can't even spell the word window, so he's not even teaching them correctly. But the whole point is that what he's doing here is exploiting the student by saying, I've taught you window, now go and clean it. And that will be your object lesson. You will know what clean and window are. All right? So he's satirizing the object lesson method. And it goes on again. Where's the second boy? Please, sir, he's weeding the garden. To be sure, says Squeers, by no means disconcerted. So he is. Bot, B-O-T, tin, T-I-N, botany, N-E-Y, botany. All right? Again, misspelled. It's B-O-T-A-N-Y. All right? But he spells it as botany. Noun substantive, a knowledge of plants. When he has learned that botany means a knowledge of plants, he goes and knows them. That's our system, Nickleby. So he basically gets the boys slaving around, cleaning the windows, scrubbing the floors, doing the garden, and he calls it his object lesson. All right? So Dickens is satirizing the idea of the object lesson, but again, he's not saying, okay, if that's wrong, Mr. Dickens, what would be the good way to do it? Doesn't really offer a kind of positive approach. So basically what he's doing, he expresses his outrage at all the injustices in the system. He satirizes things that he can see as weaknesses, and he doesn't really have his own coherent philosophy or suggestions for improving the system, because that, as far as he's concerned, that's not really his job. His job is to point out what's wrong, and it's up to the politicians and people, the social, it's up to those people to sort out, what should be done about it. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much the educational system as it was in those days, and how Dickens interacted with it.